October 10, 2018. Survive or Thrive. Neil Worthington, licensed Unity teacher and spiritual leader at Unity of Payson, Arizona.
Will be a part of the makeup of the story in the second part. So here's the story. I want to tell you the story of the Hebrews, kind of from the beginning, or what we would know of as the beginning of Hebrew Scripture in Genesis. And it begins, here you go. Anybody give me an idea of what that picture is?
Garden of Eden.
Garden of Eden. It begins in the Garden of Eden. And of course we have that described as having everything that's necessary for life, an abundant life. It's just beautiful, rapturous perfection. That's where it all began, according to the Hebrew Scriptures. But, it happened very quickly. Forgetfulness of that perfection. Forgot that everything was there. Forgot that it was perfect and intended to be perfect. And perfection underlies everything all along. But the forgetfulness was as a result of having something that was inherent and necessary, that is free will, to choose. The Hebrews had choices to make all along. And beginning in that Garden of Eden, when the choices is, even though it's said that I should not eat it, I'm going to eat that apple and I'm going to make a choice that's my choice. That's totally for me. And then the forgetfulness went on as we remember the history of the Hebrews to things like Cain and Abel, one brother killing another, to the time of Noah where it was almost hopeless. The earth was so inhabited by people who were rancorous, that were at each other's throats, who were warring with one another, that only one ray of hope, Noah and his family, was allowed, according to the story, to remain alive, and did in the flood. More wrangling, more meandering. You remember the story of the bright light of Abram, who was the one who saw that promise and claimed that promise again, that promise of thriving, that promise of perfection living itself out in life. And then there was some more meandering. Each one of these characters in the Hebrew Scriptures seems to have their highs and their lows, as do we. We get to Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, put to death, or they thought they put him to death by his brothers. He went to Egypt. And then, as we know, whatever happens in our consciousness, whatever very alive inside of us, it tends to outpicture. It tends to show up in the world. And so what did happen? Famine did happen. I'm not saying that those people that were involved, that those patriarchs were responsible for the famine, but nonetheless, that was alive in consciousness, and it showed up in their world as well. That led, of course, to going to Egypt, where there was some more abundance. Going to Egypt led to a whole number of the Hebrews relocating, going to Egypt, eventually flourishing, well, getting comfortable anyway. I don't know if they were flourishing, but getting comfortable in Egypt, and then a turn in politics led them to slavery. Interesting how that happened. And it was that way for years and years and decades. And then eventually a bright light, the baby in the basket grown up in the court of the Pharaoh, who went to the mountain and saw that promise again in terms of what we now know as the Ten Commandments. And he saw the promise and the possibility to hold that vision for his people, and went back to Egypt to eventually lead them out. Again, what happened in consciousness that beginning of a vision showed up as plagues on the land of Egypt. Something that kind of convinced leadership there to let the people go, to let the Hebrew people go. And so, in fact, they did. But where did they go after they left Egypt, got through the Red Sea, those bright lights? They wandered again. They were thirsty, they were hungry, they complained, and they did that, according to the Hebrew Scriptures, for 40 years. They had somewhat of a vision, but there was that downside too. There was that, and getting to the place of just, if we can just make it through, if we can just survive, if we can just have another meal, if we can just. Still, there was a glimmer of that light of promise. And eventually, through that wandering in the wilderness, through that survival mode, arose the promised land. The promise had been there all along. Perfection underlay everything all the time. But the promised land was suddenly that place where all of these hopes, that return to perfection, that remembering of who they were from the very beginning, again made itself known. Interesting that Moses, the one who had the vision to lead them out, didn't even go to that promised land, that land of milk and honey. By the way, the land of milk and honey means, in metaphysical terms, truth and substance. Truth and substance. So they carried with them in consciousness truth, and that outpictured in the land where what was really true from the get-go, unlimited substance, was there for them. So I'm going to leave the story there, because we know, guess what? Ups and downs occurred after that again and again and again, as is true for us. Well, let's go back and tell the story again. We got captivity, survival, thriving. Who was that? Go back one. That was Moses, standing looking at that promised land where he didn't go, that land flowing with milk and honey. Next, we're going to come back and we're going to tell the story from your perspective. So you get to create some of this story. So let's start with perfection. First of all, let me remind you that you, as a created being, are perfect. You were created that way. We say in the image and likeness of God the good. Perfection. That's where you came from. In fact, you are an expression of the divine. You are just a piece of that. You're a point of light in that great sense of light that is the divine. So let me remind you of that. And then I want you to go on. Have you ever forgotten that? I have to say that I forget it fairly regularly and need to be reminded. So forgetfulness is a result of our choices. Or maybe the choices are a result of our forgetfulness. We make choices that end up not serving us. Don't reflect that perfection at all. And where does it come? Again, what's alive within us in our consciousness is something other than the perfection that is there for us and still underlies us. Next, what happens of that is that outpicturing of consciousness eventually gets us all tied up. It may not be that someone else, although we may think someone else is doing the binding or the limiting of us, but I suspect that we have a lot to do with that limiting. We are self-limiting. There was a psychologist named Viktor Frankl. Who knows? A lot of you have heard of Viktor Frankl. So Viktor Frankl endured the concentration camps and horrors that we cannot even imagine. And he might have said that he was captive, that he was bound, that he was severely limited. And he did assent to that and said he was not at liberty to walk out of the camp, to resume his life as he might have. But he was free nonetheless to choose his response to the situation that he found himself in. I think and I'm going to talk about me for a minute, where I am most likely to go off the rails on this, remembering the perfection that I am, and where I seem limited, where I'm just bound up, I can't move ahead, I'm a captive, is in the area of how I choose to respond to the circumstances that have shown themselves in my life. I can be reactive, very much so. I can get moody. Every once in a while I really get moody and just stew in my own juice. But every once in a while I remember that, as Donna shared, we have a right in those difficult circumstances to choose something else. It's not like the circumstance ceases to exist. But we can claim a higher truth and say, this also is a part of me. Just a little bit of parenthetical thing here. We are going to begin, and we'll have this in the announcements later, a class on the spiritual practice of thriving, Prosperity Revisited. We'll do that the 17th starting this month, and I hope you'll have an opportunity to do that with us. But all of these aspects of thriving, whether it be, as I mentioned before, health, whether it be relationship, whether it be material things or money, as we often think of it, or whether it be purpose in our life. These we have to consider not only in the context of, well, that's a great thing, let me leave the rest of this aside, but the dynamic tension that exists between circumstances and the truth that we know. Sometimes the tension that occurs even between two values that are both positive in nature, but which taken to excess or de-emphasized get us into trouble and don't get us where we want to go. So as a part of that study, we're going to work with polarity mapping, polarity thinking, helping us move through the difficult circumstances, move through the positive truths, and find a way to continue to move ahead. So I really hope as many of you as possible will be able to join us for that class. Enough with the commercial. Let's get on with one more quote for captivity. And I really like this. I'm paraphrasing just a little bit. It is simply for freedom, or purely for freedom, that the Christ within us sets us free. It's an inside job. And so we have an opportunity to buy into that. So after captivity, one more thing. Your story, remember, you're thinking of your circumstances as we go along, is survival. I don't know where you're at in this continuum, but you might just be in making it through. Have you ever said, when somebody asks you how you're doing, oh, I'm surviving? Your words probably betray you in that case. Sometimes you just don't expect too much out of life, or you don't give too much to life because you just think the investment may not be worth it. So that is a survival dynamic. That is survival mentality. And I must again admit that I have been there often. And that survival mentality is a wandering in my own personal wilderness. But now we get to move to, just like Moses led that people out, shared a vision that was greater, showed the vision of real, thriving, flourishing life, so we can do that for ourselves. And we move to thriving ourselves and what that means. I'd like to suggest just a couple of things. That it means knowing who we are, not only back to that perfection, which is our creation, but knowing what is valuable to us, what our values are, core values. If I were to ask you, how long would it take you to list 5 core values that are your core values? And do you know them? Are they the same from today to tomorrow? Do you have that sense of core values for yourself? And do you know where you want to go? Have you set a strong intention or not? And then, are you scouting out the territory? Remember back in the Hebrews story, they sent out 12 spies. Everybody remember that? Into the land of milk that was flowing with milk and honey first, scouting out the territory. Are you scouting out your territory, your thriving territory, your land of milk and honey? And finally, are you taking steps of faith? Because we don't have what we desire, what we want to be the nature of our lives because we don't believe we can have it. At least that's my story. So taking steps of faith, and faith is nothing more of having the same thought over and over and over again until it becomes your predominant thought. So you may have to choose to take steps that help you establish thriving as one of your core values and the character of your life. How do I do that? I'm forgetting some of these things. I hope you'll bear with me. Number one, you do it in 4 different areas we're going to look at. Health and wellness. And here's what I look at when I look at health. I want to make practical suggestions for you. And then you put legs to them, please, in your life. Health. Big one. Stop focusing on health, dis-ease, on lack, on injury, on illness. The more you focus on it, the more you turn it around, the more you worry about it, the more you talk about it, you're going to have a hard time leaving you. So stop focusing on that. Number 2, build that belief, as we said, in wholeness. What do you do in terms of affirmations about health? Remember Myrtle Fillmore said, "Oh, I don't inherit that. That's not the nature of the divine. I don't inherit that." Do you say that to yourself? Do you build the belief in your wholeness? How do you build your belief every day? Is it a time of meditation? Is it a time of prayer? Is it a time of affirmation? Is it a time of just talking as much as you can about health and as little as you can about illness? Next, relationships. I'm sure none of you have the problems that I've had in my life with relationships, but you may have had a few. And I want to give 2 suggestions as practical ways to work with that. Number 1, engage in self-care. It almost sounds like it's going the other way. It's like you're taking care of yourself. You're not taking care of the relationship. But you know what? Just like that, pull the oxygen mask to you first so you can help somebody else. That self-care is critical. Learn to be empathetic with yourself. When you are able to do that, you'll have the fuel, you'll have the ability to go on and strengthen a relationship. It seems like you're threatening the relationship because, I'm not doing for somebody else. I got to do for them so that they'll be happy. No. Engage first in self-care and let that flow on into care for others. And that care for others part is the second. Seek to understand. Remember that prayer? You don't want to be understood, but to understand. Seek to understand. That'll mean that the flow of empathy that was to yourself is beginning to flow out to someone else. Seek to understand. That'll really spur your relationships forward to a thriving level. Next, money and material. real quickly. Do you desire something in your life? Would you like to have it in your life? Give it. Give what you desire. I would suggest, contrary as it seems to sense, that if you want more money, find where you can give money. If you want more love, find where you can give love. If you want any number of things, find how you can give in that arena. Give what you desire to have. And be great. I love this one. Because I learned this here at Unity of Payson. I learned it because one of the very first messages I gave was about gratitude. And that lesson that I gave has turned into a practice that happens every day for me. Learning to be grateful. And one of the things I'm grateful for, going back to what Donna said, is those negative kind of circumstances, those tough places. I give for the challenges in my life. I give gratitude for the challenges in my life, the difficult circumstances. So, if you would thrive with material and money, be grateful for what you have, even though it seems to be little, but just really be thoroughly grateful for what you have. And finally, in the area of purpose, as we spoke, know yourself. Take time to ask, wow, who am I? Sit down and write it out. Maybe post it on your refrigerator or on the bathroom mirror. These are my values. These are what I really believe in. These are what is true of me. And finally, ask, what is mine to do? If you're like me, you so often get deterred by doing something that seems nice, that somebody else might want you to do, that you want to do for somebody else. For me, it's not mine to do. But I don't have time to do what is mine to do, because I'm doing what isn't mine to do. So I encourage you, number one, to just give up the idea of just surviving. It's not what we were created to that's not what we're created to be, survivors. We're created to be thrivers. So I say to you all, let's do it together. Enough of just surviving, let's thrive. So it is.